My dear friends, how is your physical health? You might feel that that's a strange question to be asked on a Sunday morning. And I'm sure there are some people here who are in very good physical health. And there are some people here whose health is not that good. But we do worry about physical health. And many of us take steps to make sure that we're healthy. All kinds of recommendations, health food, and yearly checkup, all that. Physical health, tremendous emphasis on physical health. But now I have another question. How is your spiritual health? I'm sure there are some people here this morning whose spiritual health is very solid. And there are some people here whose spiritual health is not that solid. But, you know, spiritual health is more important than physical health. But we live in a world that stresses the physical health, but really doesn't stress the spiritual health. There was a book which is quite popular today. I've often mentioned it before in sermons. The title of the book is, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? It's written by, I believe, a Jewish rabbi. A popular book. And of course, it's a good question, but it's a logical question. And logical questions are looking for logical answers. And of course, there's no logical answer. We hear of bad things happening to good people. And we wonder why. Because the logical mind would say, bad things should happen to bad people. Good things should happen to good people. But often, very bad things happen to good people. And the logical mind says, unfair. But you see, God doesn't operate logically. God is not limited to the logical way of looking at life. We look at life logically, and we forget that the logical way of looking at life is only one way, and it's actually quite a limited way. So there really, to that question, why do bad things happen to good people, there isn't a good logical answer, because God doesn't operate logically. See, in the Gospel of today's Mass, Jesus addresses two situations where people suffered, like Galileans were murdered, and their blood was mixed with the blood of their sacrifices, which was a terrible thing. And then there was another incident where 18 people were killed by a falling tower. So he mentioned those two incidents, which the people at that time were so well aware of. And the question was, did that happen to them because they're more guilty than the rest of you? And he said no. See, the thinking was that, well, if a terrible thing happens to you, well then it must mean that you're a great sinner. And that was the thinking, and of course Jesus says that is not right. Tragedy came into their lives, but it wasn't because they were great sinners. But then he goes on to say, but if you don't repent, you will likewise perish. And then you might say, well, that's a contradiction. But really and truly, you see, we worry about physical death. We're scared about physical death. But you see, there's a far worse death, and that's spiritual death. If we were as worried about spiritual death as physical death, we'd have a far better world. And you see, the reason we have such terrible problems in the world, violence, everything, there's a lot of spiritual death. People are physically alive but spiritually dead. Or else people are physically alive but spiritually very weak. And as a result, terrible things are happening, and we're all suffering. We're all suffering. I mean, you read about the terrible violence, and we're all impacted by it. We don't like to read about this terrible violence. A lot of people don't want to read the newspapers because of the violence and terrible things happening. But we're all impacted by the sadness of life. But he's saying to us that if the world was spiritually healthy, we'd have a far better world. we'd all be much more happy. But the world isn't spiritually healthy. Many people are not spiritually healthy because they don't worry about the spiritual side of their lives. They're only worried about the materialistic side of their life. And then terrible things happen, and we all suffer from what happens. But a great saint who lived many centuries ago now, Sister St. Catherine of Siena, she made the comment, it's heaven all the way to heaven. And we hear that and we said, what's she talking about? What she's talking about, spiritual health. See, she was a woman who was spiritually healthy. And she had to deal with tremendous hardship in life. She was a strong woman, a courageous woman. She confronted popes and bishops about injustice in the church. But she had the courage to do so. And she was rejected and resented and not liked. And she suffered from ill health. But she was a very, very happy woman. Deep down, she was happy. She was spiritually healthy. And she could feel in her being a joy. Even though she was dealing with great sadness, she was always feeling this joy. And she had great compassion for the sick and the dying. And she said, it's heaven all the way to heaven. See, when you're spiritually healthy, you could be physically falling apart, and you still would have a joy. And that's what Jesus is talking about. Unless we all repent, we will all perish. Because we'll have to go through the miserable life that we have already known. Let me say another example. I've often mentioned her as Mother Teresa, a modern-day saint. But her life, as you know, was spent on the streets of Calcutta, picking up the dying. And then she went around the world, taking care of the dying. And her sisters did likewise. Now, many people couldn't do that work. They would be so depressed and so discouraged. But she wasn't depressed or discouraged. Because Mother Teresa had great spiritual health. She had an inner joy that gave her the ability to do the work that she did. She saw Christ in every person she met. She looked at the wounded and the dying. She could see the face of Christ. And that gave her joy. And that's what the world needs. We need spiritual health. We have lots of hospitals. They're all concerned about physical health. If we had hospitals for spiritual health, we'd have a much greater world.